are the most common symptoms that children with JHD exhibit?
Let me just briefly say that, first of all, juvenile onset Huntington's disease is Huntington's disease, so that there is a lot of crossover. It's the same disease in many respects. So the three broad symptoms of category of symptoms, motor, cognitive, and behavioral, are similar, but there are definitely important differences. So the similarities are mostly in the cognitive or the thinking skills and the behaviors. And just like adult onset, those symptoms behaviorally and cognitively can sometimes come on before the motor symptoms. So very similar kind of pattern where people will see changes in thinking skills or changing in behavior that may precede the actual diagnosis, which, like adult onset, is defined by motor symptoms. In the cognitive realm, it's very similar. Depending on when the onset is, it's just changes in thinking skills. And for someone who's very young, it may be that they no longer progress in development of skills. For those who develop it older, it may be that they reach a certain point and then they start decreasing. So in particular, changes in school performance would be a real big indicator for that. Behavior in many ways is similar as it is in adult onset. And very broadly, we talk about what's called externalizing behavior, the kind of behavior that other people can see, or internalizing behavior that's only felt inside. So as an example, mood, feeling sad or depressed or anxious, is an internalized symptom. Externalizing is more hyperactivity or impulsiveness or aggression. And much like adult onset, juvenile onset is much more likely to have externalizing symptoms: attention deficit, impulsivity, aggression. The motor symptoms are the things that are the most different between the two forms of disease. And that is, in general, adult onset Huntington's is considered to be hyperactive, right? So chorea is increase in movement, right? Hyperactive. Where the juvenile onset of the disease, the motor symptoms are more likely to be hypoactive. In many ways, also described as Parkinson's-like. Instead of moving too much, often what you'll get is slowness. So what's called bradykinesia, or slowing of movement, or stiffness of movement. And those things can present, once again, much differently. For those who are very young and who have an onset before the age of 10, some of the most common presenting motor symptoms are changes in gait and walking. But once again, the stiffness, and instead of chorea, having tremor. So this is something that you don't see necessarily in adult onset. You see it in Parkinson's disease. But children with juvenile onset Huntington's disease are more likely to have a tremor. And so those are the differences in the broad scheme. There are also some symptoms that are pretty unique to juvenile onset, and that is seizures. So seizures are really uncommon in adult onset, but they happen up to 30% in juvenile onset. Really importantly, however, it's typically those who develop it before the age of 12. Seizures can be common, but really in the very early disease state. A couple of other things I think are real common and somewhat unrecognized is pain. So pain for juvenile onset that can sometimes be, we've done this with a survey study where we evaluated families with this, and it seems to be most common in the legs. We don't know what the etiology of that, we don't know what's causing that pain, but it is something that the kids will often complain about. And another very unique symptom for juvenile onset is itching, or some kind of phenomenon which feels like itching, because there's no associated rash. We call it non-dermatologic itching, which means you have the feeling that you have to itch or scratch. But when you look at the skin, there's nothing there that looks like it's inflamed or a rash. So that's a relatively unique, and it's a very uncomfortable thing, but once again, something that we typically see in the juvenile onset that we don't see in adults. And like I said, I think the other things that are a little bit more common in juvenile onset, sleep disturbance. We see that in adults as well, but in juvenile onset, it is really impressive and significant, staying up for days at a time. And so these are things that are obviously really difficult behaviorally to deal with as well. But once again, I think the broad strokes are to think of it as the same disease with the same kind of foundation of symptoms, and in many ways the same progression, where you often see cognitive and behavioral before you see motor.